Hey everybody, this is Tom from Rocket Restorations, and today I got a fun, exciting video for you. We're going to do the ultimate Max Wedge video. This is one, so I started a video last week about a couple Max Wedge blocks I did and how to ID them, but then I was talking with my friend Scott Smith, and he's like, well, I have all the stuff and you're going to be in my place in a couple days, so let's just do a video on basically everything Max Wedge. So this one's going to be pretty exciting. Scott's going to guest host basically today. I'm going to film him and interview him as we go through. We're going to show you how to identify Max Wedge parts, how to tell originals from reproductions, the differences in the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 intakes, the differences in the heads, and the differences in the carburetors too. There's a lot of differences on these things, and how to identify the top pads and stampings. This is going to be the ultimate Max Wedge video. If there's anything you want to know about Max Wedge, what they used, what they didn't use, this is going to be the video for you. If you think I know a lot about Mopars, Scott puts me to shame. So Scott runs Harms Automotive, which is a carb restoration company, and basically just kind of does everything Mopar. He is a judge at McCacken. They do like an originality survivor at McCacken. He's one of the 3 judges for that. He has a ton of knowledge on this stuff, has been doing this a long time, and luckily he has a giant hoard of Max Wedge parts. Here's an example of his 6-pack carb restoration. You can see how beautiful these things look. I just gave him the carbs for the 1970 V-Code Sport Fury GT.
So today we're going to talk about Max Wedge blocks. The Max Wedge block is looked at as the pinnacle of the wedge block designs. It was the maximum performance version of these blocks. But the blocks themselves weren't really that unique, other than some machining differences in the stamping numbers on the pads, which identified them as Max Wedge blocks. Otherwise, they were your typical 426 wedge or 413 block, depending on the year. And that's really it. So a lot of people don't understand the differences. Some of the minor things that can be added by a good machine shop are the cylinder eyebrows for the valve clearances. And they all have these from the factory. You'll see one here and here. And they're very subtle. And someone could add that if they were trying to phony up a block, but you can tell if they're original if you have a good eye for it. And then on the top of the block, you see the ID pad, which we highlighted with some white ink to make it easier to see. The font was done in a different font style than the regular production passenger car blocks because they were done on the marine line and they had different stamp sets. These are larger font than your typical street engine would have. So you see here it's 426 T, which means this was a 1963 engine, and M, which is for maximum, and P for performance. And then the date it was assembled, which we can see here, it looks like an 8, and 15, might be a 3, it's hard to see. So 815, and then this was the 13th engine assembled on that shift. And that tells you the history of the block, that's what it is. So this would have been a 1963 Max Wedge engine, low compression engine. If it were a high compression, it would have an additional stamping, which would be an HC.
And here's an example of a 64 Max Wedge 426. So it says 426, V is 64, MP is maximum performance, and there's the HC for high compression that Scott mentioned on the high compression motors. And what are the 2 compression ratios they used?
It's right around 11-to-1 for the low compression and 13-to-1 for the high compression.
Here's a table of all the compression ratios for the years and what they were.
And then you have on the front of the block, all these castings, street versions and Max Wedges, would have this AAQA, but that's not a Max Wedge certainty if you see that. It's just should be there for a Max Wedge. And of course, on the side of the block, you'll see the casting number and the casting date. Of course, these engines didn't have VIN numbers because that didn't start until 1968. So.
And also keep in mind that it says 10/11/62. Keep in mind production for 1963 started August 1st. So 10/11/62 is correct for 63. A lot of people see the 62 and think it has to be a 62 block, but keep in mind that this is a 63 block with that date.
That's exactly right. So that pretty much sums up the details on a Max Wedge block. You need to look at the stamping and make sure that it has the correct font, size, and characters for the marine assembly line, and the proper stampings that identify the year and the compression. Those are always going to be there if it's a proper block that hasn't been modified.
Another term that's kind of misunderstood on these is the stages. So that's not really something that came up till later. It's kind of what people kind of made up. I've never seen any documentation back in the day that kind of refers to the stages, but there's kind of three stages on the Max Wedge blocks that people talk about. So stage one was the 62 413 right there. That was the 413. The 3/8 pickup, the earlier head, blah, blah, blah. And then stage two tends to be the 63, which is the 426, kind of the first half of the year. And then stage three is the late 63, 64 Max Wedge that has the more modern heads with eliminate the rocker stands, 6-bolt valve covers, the late intake that we showed you, the 3705 carburetor, so a little bit bigger. So that's kind of considered the three stages. But again, they didn't really do that back in the day. That wasn't a thing they really talked about. That's something that kind of came up later. But if you're wondering, you know, if people refer to stage one, stage two, stage three, that's kind of what they're talking about. So here's an example of a 62 and a 63 block. These came from fairly famous Mopar drag racer, Dan Dvorak. I just did a video on these a little while ago. That's a 413 and 440. We were trying to figure out what they are. But these are the Max Wedge versions that I got from that. And my plan was to do a video just on these, but you know, had the opportunity to go over to Scott's and really see the good stuff. So, and I decided to kind of make it into a big kind of the ultimate Max Wedge video. So these two blocks are interesting. So this one has the stamp right here. It says 413 HP HC, which means the HP means high performance, HC means high compression, and the 7562 is the assembly date, which is super, super late. I mean, that was like almost the last week of production, which is crazy. This one also has some interesting stuff in here. I don't know what these are for. I don't know if there was some like oil pan in there to like keep oil on the lifters or something, but I don't know. I've never seen that before. The other interesting thing about this one is I got it magged by my machine shop, Johnson's, who are great. And this one is a 413, but it's born out plus 188. It's like 440 plus on the bore on that, which is crazy. And then one sleeve has been repaired. So it's bored out. It's standard. It's, you know, almost a 440 size of the 413. And there's one sleeve there. So everything looks really nice on this block. Nothing's cracked. But the problem is it's probably going to need to be sleeved just because of, you know, how big the bore is on this. And then that one, you can kind of see the sleeve into the water jacket. So that one's going to take a little bit of care to do that. So you're going to need to re-sleeve all 8 cylinders, and that one's going to need a little extra care to it. So this one over here is the 63 Max Wedge block. And this one's actually a pretty early one. So this one says 426 TMP HC. HC means high compression, which is 12.5 to 1. And the 9/12/62 is the assembly date. And of course, a lot of people see the 62 and say, oh, it's a 62 motor. Well, 63 production generally started the first week of August. It varied a little bit by what that was. So September 21, 62 is 63 model year. Oops, I forgot to show you the casting date on this one. Casting date on this one is 4/5/62. So this one actually sat around for about 3 months before it got built. And then this one over here, casting date is, looks like 8/23/62. So this one sat around for like a week and a half. Boy, this one got cast and got put together right away. The problem with this block is this whole corner was blown off at some point. It has been repaired. You can see the repair there. It's not the prettiest repair I've ever seen in the world. It has a little patch there, but that is there. And then a little patch on this side. I did not get this one cleaned and magged just because I kind of look at the condition of the block and I'm like, it's probably not worth spending the $150 doing that. But you know, it kind of is what it is. The biggest problem with this one is I believe it cracked this cap whenever the rod went out. So all these caps look right. The line bore looks good, but on this one, see the lip there? So I believe this is actually a 383 cap rather than a raised deck block caps. There's actually bigger bearings on a 440 versus a 383 size, or, you know, 413, 426, 440 is the RB, 361, 383, 400 is the B, the low deck. But that's probably what they did there. The hard part on this one is going to be, so these caps need to be basically like tight in here. You want zero movement in there. So you're basically gonna have to build that up with some weld and like grind it down to get this cap to sit in here straight. That's gonna take some pretty serious work to do that, but it is doable. This is a real Max Wedge block. You know, it's kind of like a Hemi block. You know, it doesn't really matter how bad this is. It's a real Max Wedge block, so somebody will try to fix it. The question is, what's it worth? I don't know. That's a really good question, and I'm gonna have to do some research to figure that out. So, but just thought I'd show you these two that I have in my shop here. Very neat blocks. And on the 62 only block, the casting number is right there. It's 1852029. -1. I can't remember if I mentioned the -1 is how many times they use the moldings, and pretty much every Max Wedge block I ever sees that. And it has a big T on the side because these came from like a heavy duty truck block basically, and that's what that means. Very cool. Casting number over here we showed you is 2406730, again -1 because Max Wedge block. And then the often mixed up 65 street wedge, 64 and 65 came up with their own casting number. A lot of people think those are Max Wedge blocks, but they are not. They're just a 426 wedge street block. And here's what that casting number looks like and what the top pad looks like. Here's an example of a 1964 426 street wedge. V means 64, 42 is the first two numbers of 426. 25 is the assembly date, and HP is high performance. And here's an example of a 1965 426 street wedge. A means 1965. That's when they started the letter sequence. So, for example, B is 1966, C is 1967. 426 is obviously the displacement, 426 wedge. 813 is the assembly date, which is 8/13/1964. Keep in mind that is 1965 model year. And of course, HP means high performance. And here's what the casting number looks like on a 1965 426 wedge. So these actually have their own unique casting number. And as far as I know, in all my records I can find, this casting number, the 2532230, was never made as a Max Wedge motor. And then you can see the casting date on the bottom, 9/25/64, which again is 1965 model year. And I've had a lot of people come to me and swear that this block is a Max Wedge block. Well, keep in mind, they started making Hemis in February of 1964 for the Daytona 500. And barely shortly after that, they stopped making the 426 Max Wedge blocks because they were obsolete. The Hemi was the new block to have for race cars. So the fact that this is cast 9/25/64 means it is impossible for it to be a Max Wedge block.
So now we're going to talk about the exhaust manifolds on a Max Wedge, which are quite unique. These big ram's horn style exhaust manifolds, which, you know, people say they're super heavy. They're not terribly heavy, but they're heavier than your average manifold. You'll see here the casting number, which is, it's hard to read, but 2402386, and then H2 and 2, which that would be the date code of the manifold. So if you look at this manifold compared to the reproduction manifolds out there, they're going to have a completely different number cast here. And that number was fictitious on purpose to avoid copyright infringements with Chrysler. So they put in 413 for the 413, 426, and 440 all in a row. And that would be the number for the reproduction manifold. So that pretty much sums up the differences. Otherwise, the reproductions look just like these. But these are the real deal.
They have the extra heavy duty flange here for the Max Wedge and a 4-bolt output too, which is super neat. That was just on race stuff basically.
Correct. And these cars came with a special exhaust system with bolt-on caps for cutouts, already incorporated in the dual exhaust system. So all that worked together to really help these things breathe. So now we're going to talk about the cylinder heads on a Max Wedge engine, and they're quite unique. First of all, there were some changes during production from 1962 to 1964, and they weren't all done year to year. There were some mid-year changes, so it's a little bit difficult to explain. The earliest Max Wedges were the 413 Max Wedges, and those had 413 cubic inches, of course, the same differences that these blocks had with the eyebrows and the cylinders and the special stampings on the pad, but these heads were unique. Now the early heads, where the casting number is right here on the bottom side, which is 2402286. You can see the numbers here. Those were the early heads. One thing about Max Wedge heads, which they all share, is that they did not have a heat crossover in the center. This is blinked off. All other wedge heads for production engines will have a hole right here for the heat to the choke.
Here's a bit crusty 906 head we have here, and here's an example of what the heat crossover looks like right there. So on the Max Wedge, that's all smooth. On any basically non-race motor, they had that hole that sent exhaust gas through the intake underneath the carburetor and under the choke to basically actuate the choke.
So these lack that, and then they have these extra large ports that are called Max Wedge ports. And if you compare this to a standard wedge port, they're quite a bit larger and taller mostly.
And here's an example of what the smaller port looks like, albeit with some spider webs and a little bit of rust.
They're a closed chamber design, which means part of the cylinder is even with the deck surface here. It's not a big open area like later heads past 67.
And this is what we mean by open chamber. So you can see right here, there's a lip right there. So on a closed chamber head, that whole flat area right there is flush with the bottom of the head. And basically what that means is on a closed chamber head, you get more compression because there's less combustion chamber. On an open chamber, they open that up to have basically lower compression. So it can run lower octane gas and won't have as much chance at detonation.
So this is a Max Wedge function. They have the larger exhaust valve, which is a key to their making more power than a standard wedge. I believe they're 188 valve.
Valve size is 208 on the intake and 188 on the exhaust.
These had a 4-bolt valve cover from 1962 to midway 63.
Here's a real crusty valve cover to show you, but as it midway through 63, 64, they added the 5th and 6th bolts on either end because they didn't seal very well.
And they also had a cast aluminum rocker stand and adjustable solid rockers.
Here's what those rocker stands look like. So they're cast aluminum. These are obviously not adjustable rockers. They're the standard hydraulic setup, but that's basically what they look like. And then in 64, when they redesigned the head, the stands were cast into it with just a rocker on there, and that was it. And then clamps to hold that down.
So that you could adjust your push rods. These had solid cams. Everything was solid. So these were made for racing. And then of course the corresponding 4-bolt style valve covers, which fit these heads. Now in 64, pardon me, through late 63, they introduced a better, deeper breathing head called the 518 casting, which is the last 3 digits of the casting. That head was slightly better than this head in flow. They had a cast-in rocker stand instead of the bolt-on style. And other than that, they were pretty much the same head, and they had a 6-bolt valve cover design. So that was the first time they used that design. And that pretty much sums up the Max Wedges on the heads. So now we're going to talk about the Max Wedge intake manifold designs. Now in 1962, they introduced it on the 413, and it had this wild cross ram design where the carburetors were kitty corner from one another. And you know, they had the smaller primary and secondary larger carburetors, which was the 3447 Carter carburetor, which was the smaller carburetor that the Max Wedges used. And we'll talk about those later. But the biggest difference in identifying this early style manifold was that, you know, these openings were smaller on one side. That's a quick visual. And there's a step on the top of the intake. You can see this looks like a notch or a step down. It's on the front and rear of the intake in these two places. Now, in 1963, they did some slight modifications to this manifold, which helped it flow a little bit better. And they also incorporated those bigger carburetors we talked about, which are the 3705 Carter carburetors. So they went to this design in late 63. This would be called the Stage 3 to most people. And this has, you'll see the slope here instead of this notch. So this is a quick visual ID on these intake manifolds, or these, I call them a ramp or a slope from the top surface to the transition down. Now, these intakes also had the larger openings for the bigger 3705 carburetors. So if you compare these side by side, you'll see these are smaller, these are larger, like the secondaries. And then the linkage for these was a bell crank style manual linkage, and that was the same for both designs, as was the cable bracket and some of the other small dress-up items. These plugs that you see here, are here so that you can access the intake manifold bolts to bolt it to the engine.
And what were those from?
These plugs have been used for a lot of things. The little 7 1/4 peanut rear end oil drain plug has one of these exact plugs if you're looking for a plug. But yeah, they were used for quite a few things.
I used to like go through wrecking yards and pull out those plugs for Max Wedge intakes out of 7 1/4 ends out of A bodies.
Hey, if you need one, it's a cheap way to get them for sure, because people charge quite a bit for those things. Anyway, so that pretty much sums up the intakes. There was 2 basic designs. The earliest ones didn't have a casting date. That'd be the 413 62s. They eventually added a casting date, which this particular one has, which tells me it's probably an early 63 intake. You can see it. It's kind of hard to read, but it's right here.
Also, what's interesting is you can't tell by the casting number. So you can see the differences in the intakes right here, but the casting number is the same on the intake.
That's correct. And you know, this one is dated May 14th of 63. And this one, I can't read it, but maybe your phone can pick it up, Tom.
to 1963.
So this is an early 63, and this is a late 63, early or 64.
Just 3 months apart.
Yeah, and there's the transition. So Max Wedge carburetors, basically 2 different styles. They had the early AFB, which is the smaller CFM. These factory ratings were off. It was in the neighborhood of 6 1/4, like the later Hemis had. But it's a smaller AFB design, and you'll notice that it has the smaller primary or secondaries and primaries are bigger, and then an air valve adjustment for the idle speed, which is something that you'll see on early carburetors, and it's not the most precise thing.
And the number on these is 3447 SA, and the date code on this one is C3.
Right. And now what that means is C3 would be A, B, C. So January, February, March. So it's March of 63 manufacturing date. And the 3447 signifies that it's the earlier, smaller AFB. This is what all of the 62 413 Max Wedges and the first half or so of the 63 Max Wedge would have, and that would have been a 426 on that early intake we looked at before. Now, in 63 and a half or so, they introduced the larger 3705 Carter carburetor, and these had more CFM. They had the larger air horn that most people are familiar with is like the later AVS carburetor. This is not an air vacuum secondary carburetor, it's mechanical, but it appears to be one. And this will use the larger air cleaner base. We haven't gotten into that because I don't have any air cleaners here to show you, but the later air cleaners have a larger base and the early ones have a smaller base to fit these carburetors. And these also have a different idle speed adjustment, which is on the side in the linkage over here, which is more accurate than this air valve adjustment that they had in the early design. And then, of course, they have the standard idle mixture screws, but there's a manual choke design, and that's what this linkage is. All Max Wedges were manual chokes, so there was a cable that came from the firewall that split and went to each carburetor and operated them, and this early carburetor had the same design. So in general, that's the basics on these. Now, the production line carburetors for the 3705s lacked the stamping that you typically see on the foot. Now, this particular one is an aftermarket one, like an over-the-counter carburetor, so it does have a number. But they didn't have this from the production line. So if you have one that's blank, the reason for that is it used to have a foil tag that signified 3705. Now, they also used this exact same carburetor. Here's another example for this early 64 Hemi, the race Hemi. It's the same CFM, the same design, but this number on this carburetor is a 3861, and you can see it on the foil tag there. So exact same carburetor. The only differences were jetting and metering rods. One for the Hemi, one for the Max Wedge. They would interchange freely and they looked identical, and they all lacked the number on the base. So theoretically, you could use either one as a proper Max Wedge carburetor, just depending on the foil tag you put on it. So that's the carburetor story, pretty basic.
And here's what the air cleaners look like. Obviously, there's two of these. The top is the same on both, and they're a real, thin, narrow design because that cross ram intake sticks up so high in the engine bay. And then there's two different bases, as Scott just mentioned. There's the AFB base, and then there's the 3705 base, which has obviously the larger opening than the AFB, which is similar to like a modern Edelbrock, ABS2. Pretty much every carburetor from 68 up use that opening. And here's the Max Wedge oil pan, which was unobtainium for years and years and years. Luckily, Vans Auto stepped up and stamped them out, and they're available. So it's a 7-quart pan with baffles in it, and it's a really good design. It holds a lot of oil and does really well, and I'm really glad those things are available now. A lot of special parts on these motors, and here's another one I wanted to show you. This is a swinging oil pickup. They actually use swinging pickups in these. So the theory was when you slammed on the gas, the pickup would go backwards to match all the oil. The problem is in the theory and reality didn't quite match up. There's actually a bulletin out there in late 63, early 64 that they were going to put solid units in and not run these anymore. But from what I've been able to read from Greg and a few other sources, that they've never seen a production Max Wedge motor that didn't have the swinging pickup, but who knows? It's really hard to say. So they started out with a 3/8 unit, which was the standard big block, and apparently that wasn't enough for them. So when the 426 came out, they went to a 1/2-inch pickup on that. And obviously, 1/2-inch, more oil. Hemi's used that too in the later motors. Most everything uses a 3/8 except for Hemi, which uses a 1/2-inch on that. Thanks to Evan for letting me borrow this for pictures. And they actually used a stronger rod on these cars too. So the part number on this is 240-6395, unique part number to the Max Wedge. And I don't know, I'm assuming the 62-413 didn't use this because this is a 63-64 part number. So I'm guessing this was probably a running change on the Max Wedge motor to use the heavier duty rod. And here's what the choke cables look like. It was 2 individual cables that went to each carburetor, and then they had a knob on the inside that you could pull with a choke on it. The 1963 and 64 Chrysler 300J used a very similar setup. And here's what it looks like in the engine bay. This is a picture from Mosier. So it kind of went all the way around to the one carburetor. Kind of a neat setup, and because there's really no way to put an automatic choke on that cross ram intake, so it had to be manual. Well, just want to thank Scott Smith for guest hosting on this video. It was really nice. He's got a lot of knowledge about this stuff, and he's got more toys than I do, so he's got a lot of stuff to play with. So, and it's really nice actually showing this stuff. I mean, obviously I'm showing you pictures in this video as well as showing you actual stuff, but it's real nice to have the actual stuff here. Also, I want to send a shout out to Greg Lane. A lot of the information I got on this too, like some of the cast numbers and stuff. He runs a website, maxwedge.com. He has a ton of good information on there, and a lot of the number stuff came from Greg. He did a lot of research on this years and years ago, and he's kind of like that website's kind of the Bible for Max Wedge information. Also want to give a shout out to my buddy Dan Pausch. He's the one who had most of the Max Wedge pictures in his archive for reference. All right, well, this is Tom from Rocket Restorations. I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.